Chad Daybell's trial is over, but it didn't go without some drama. Chad's demeanor throughout the trial has been, for the most part, unremarkable, or I guess you could say predictable. Through his patterns, we see him raise his chin quite high, especially when there was talk about his murdered wife, Tammy Daybell, and he's been known to enjoy hearing some of the details, let's just say, which was actually really hard to watch at. But on closing argument day, there was a very animated Chad Daybell. The most I've seen in the entire trial, which went on for 2 months. It was during the prosecution segment that he had a little pattern. Prosecutor Lindsay Blake summarized the whole trial and tied it all nicely with a little bow, but Chad disagreed in quite a few areas, and I think it's important to point out. I'm Linda with It's a Crime, so now let's get into it. Closing arguments in the Chad Daybell trial was really, really powerful, and I'll have a link to that in the description box below. Now, Lindsay Blake is quite talented, and she's able to give the details, the timeline it all together, and present it in a way that's easy to understand, yet very compelling. During my live streams of the trial, we would cheer Lindsay on and the prosecution, and there would be moments, though, where John Pryor would sling a whole slew of mud, let's just say. She wasn't having any of it. Lindsay was amazing. So during her closing arguments, Lindsay started off way back when Chad and Lori Vallow first met, progressing through each of the murders, including Lori's fourth husband, Charles Vallow, which, by the way, his trial and Brandon Boudreau's will be coming up in August, and you know we'll be here for it, and I'll be live streaming that. So Lindsay walked us through Charles and the attempt made on Brandon Boudreau, which, by the way, Chad gave a look of getting away with it, in my opinion, but not for long.
However, just weeks later, the Fremont County Sheriff's Office was contacted by the Gilbert Police Department about that attempted shooting of Brandon Boudreau. They'd linked the Jeep that was used in that to the Fremont County area. And more specifically, they wanted them to check if it was at on Chad Daybell's property.
Lindsay walked the jury through each of the victims in this trial, Tylee Ryan, J.J. Vallow, and Tammy Daybell, reiterating no signs of grief or remorse by Chad Daybell. Echoing through her speech was another theme, that Chad was the teacher, and Alex Cox, who was Chad's brother-in-law and his partner in crime, she said Alex believed Chad 100%.
Tammy was possessed. Her death percentage was low. Alex believed Chad 100%.
And as she walked through the facts and details, Chad didn't seem to be bothered, except for some areas where it seemed he wanted the details to be fixed. So let's look at it and chat about it in the comments as to what your thoughts are on this. Is he still hiding something? What did the prosecution not get right? And it's important to note that during this whole trial, Chad has been pretty quiet. There's been a few moments, but on this day of closing arguments, Chad had a few eyebrow raises, some head shaking, and even mouthing some things. But a lot of the facts were laid out by Lindsay, and he doesn't disagree in most areas. And now it leads me to wonder, is he bothered that if he's going to go down for these crimes that he wants it done just right? Just like the way the graves were dug meticulously, according to the detective and the experts. Why that day? Why on closing arguments day was he so animated? Was he in despair? I don't know. I doubt it. I think he revels in the details and wanted it just so. Let me know your thoughts below. And he had no problems with the details, such as giving Melanie Pulowski's kids a reason to scream, it was said. There was no reaction. Or Brandon or Charles being dark. No reaction.
He ends up saying, yes, if they are going to act up, we'll at least give them a reason to scream. These are young children. And specifically, these are the children of Melanie Pulowski that are being referenced.
And just as a side note, on the day of closing arguments, Chad Daybell wore his murderous red tie, and notable, he even wore it with his little buddy John Pryor, which was a double whammy, dial red for murder. Oh, the lapidity of it all. Now, there are 5 specific areas in particular that Chad had issues with: Tammy, Tylee, JJ, Detective Hermosillo / law enforcement, and a search. And I'm throwing in a bonus in of John Pryor, not that Chad had issues with, but John was very, very uncomfortable. Number 1, the search, SSW Wind. During the trial, Tammy and Chad's daughter Emma was on the stand. She was clearly coached, and even the jurors thought so, but she claimed that she is the one who did a Google search of SSW Wind, not Chad Daybell. And Lindsay brought up that Chad searched it and he didn't like it. Twice it came up in closing arguments. Have a look.
And there was some testimony about a Google search for southwest wind. And that would have been on 9/8 of 19. Do you recall that?
I do.
And was that your father who did that search?
That was me.
And what was the purpose of doing that search?
I saw a rainstorm. We were planning an outdoor event and I wanted to know if those clouds were coming our way. The weather forecast for where we live in Rexburg is sometimes inaccurate because we don't live in Rexburg. So I was trying to be an amateur meteorologist, and the weather app said it was coming from the southwest, and I didn't know if that meant it was coming or going from the southwest. And so I did a Google search on the desktop computer that my parents kept in the living room.
You indicated that you live kitty corner to your parents', or that you did live kitty corner to your parents' residence. Is that right?
Yes, I used to.
What direction was that from your parents' residence?
It was towards Rexburg, which I believe is to the southwest.
And you indicated that on September 8th, you were searching for southwest wind.
Yes,
So you happened to be searching for southwest wind the last day Tylee Ryan was seen alive?
yes,
The day before Alex Cox or a device associated with him was on your dad's property?
yes,
The day before your dad sent your mom a message about shooting a raccoon and burning limbs on that property?
yes.
And what is Chad Daybell doing on September 8th of 2019? He's looking up southwest wind. Why does this matter? Remember how Tylee was found. Remember what happened to her. You heard that Lori, Tylee, JJ, and Alex moved from Chandler to Rexburg. You heard about that through multiple investigators, multiple witnesses. You heard how Chad Daybell Googled southwest wind and visited a website. Detective Stubbs talked about that. Analyst Heidemann talked about that.
Number 2, the body has to die if they're a zombie. Chad disagreed with this. In 8 different instances in the closing arguments, Chad shook his head no when this was brought up. He mouthed the words no and even did the yeah kind of look and topped it off with a smirk.
Chad said Charles was dark. Charles was a zombie. Chad said if someone's a zombie, the body has to die. Alex shot and killed Charles Vallow. Alex 100% believed Chad. Chad, again, is the only one that can determine someone's death percentage. How close someone is to dying is determined by Chad Daybell. Before Lori moved to Rexburg, Chad had already shared with her that Tylee was dark and JJ was dark. And we know what has to happen if someone's dark. If someone's dark and they're an earthly obstacle, the body has to die. Chad labels someone dark. Chad says if someone's so dark or a zombie, the body has to die. Alex believes Chad 100%. If Chad labels someone dark or a zombie, the body has to die. Chad determines the death percentage. When the death percentage hits 0, that person's been marked for death. Tammy's now a zombie, essentially, or she has a dark entity in her. Again, someone's dark, someone's a zombie, the body has to die. And Chad can tell and controls the death percentages. Someone's dark, the body has to die. Chad doesn't want to wait. Chad determines if people are dark or possessed. Chad rates their death percentage, and we all know what Chad said. Dark people, possessed people, the body has to die. You heard Melanie Gibbs' statement in that recording. Alex said, I don't want to know where JJ is. You know who labels people dark. You know what has to happen to the body. And Alex believed Chad 100%.
Number 3, Tylee's remains in the fire pit. And I hated that Chad heard the gruesome details repeated throughout the trial. I maintain that Chad revels in these details. It's why he makes those stupid references to baseball when he phones the mortuary asking for a ballpark figure on Charles' remains. And Charles had a bat involved in his case, and Charles was a former pro ball player. It's why there were coded emails. And of course, we can't forget the raccoon text. He loves to revel in that. Little dupers. I had a further meaning to that raccoon text that I broke down, and I'll have that in the description box below so you could take a look. Now, Lindsay talks about Tylee's remains in the pet cemetery and the fire pit, but he is bothered whenever she says fire pit. Notable, in trial, there was a diagram of a skeleton highlighting what parts were missing from Tylee that were never recovered, which was a part of her skull and also some of her limbs. Question is, where are they?
Chad Daybell sends a message to his wife around the same time that device is there. Well, I've had an interesting morning. I felt I should burn all of the limb debris by the fire pit before it got too soaked by the coming storms. Limb debris, not tree, limb debris. While I did so, I spotted a big raccoon along the fence. I hurried and got my gun, and he was still walking along. I got close enough that one shot did the trick. He is now in our pet cemetery. Fun times. Where was Tylee Ryan's body found? Where those red data points are. In Chad Daybell's pet cemetery. Some of her remains in the fire pit. Tylee had been discarded in a pet cemetery with some of her remains in the fire pit as well. The investigators collected the bones, tissue, organs, and what has been described as a burnt mass.
Number 4, Chad took JJ upstairs the night before he went missing. Now, Chad disagrees when this topic is spoken of Chad taking JJ upstairs in Lori's apartment and then JJ scratching him. Well, correction, he has a problem about going up the stairs in that detail, but doesn't disagree about the scratches.
And before that, you'd heard from Melanie Gibb and David Warwick about how they were visiting Lori. They'd come up for an event, and they were staying at Lori's house. You heard from them, from Melanie Gibb in particular, that there was an incident where Chad took JJ upstairs. And when Chad came down, he had scratches on his neck, that being Chad had scratches. And when asked what happened, he basically said JJ had freaked out.
Number 5, Chad had problems with law enforcement and Detective Hermosillo, even though the ladies didn't.
Back in October, Lori had messaged Chad about Alex. She had some concerns. She ends up telling Chad he would be the one they used to get us both. Who is they? Law enforcement.
Notable, John Pryor kept bringing up Detective Hermosillo, Emma Daybell did, Joseph Murray did, and they just kept talking about how Detective Hermosillo would go into a exercise class and bug Emma Daybell. There's all kinds of things that they were alleging. And then Emma's husband, Joseph, it actually came out when he was on the witness stand of how much he disliked or had disdain for law enforcement. So that was a notable moment.
So you wouldn't disagree that for law enforcement to drive back and forth by this property, that they may have suspected the bodies were, and in fact found the bodies there. That wouldn't necessarily be unusual, would it?
Perhaps no. However, this was even after the bodies were taken out, that he would slowly drive by the property.
And to that point, so you would disagree that a detective who discovers bodies on a property, arrests somebody from the property, might have a surveillance or investigative interest in continuing to drive by the property to identify if someone else was coming back to the property after the bodies had removed. You don't disagree with that, do you?
I don't see the reason for it.
You're not a law enforcement officer, are you?
Absolutely not. I would rather choose any other profession.
Okay.
Choose any other profession.
Now, number 6, we move on to Tammy Daybell. And there's been so many questions surrounding her death, but one thing for certain, he planned her murder as well. And he didn't have an issue with her asphyxia cause of death, but seemed to have a problem with the restraining detail, and that it was said that she didn't have health issues leading up. He has a problem with that. But first, we have to rewind to the first attempt on her life 10 days before. Emma Daybell's husband, Joseph Murray, she is Emma Murray, he had stated that he heard Tammy scream, and Chad doesn't agree with that. So what else does he know? What happened? Also, when there was talk about paintball guns and an assault rifle, Chad had some smirks and tells as well. One thing that I had wondered or teeter on was if it was really an attempt on Tammy that night or if it was a test of sorts. I have my reasons. I'll do that in another video, but I'm curious about Chad's reactions.
What else we know from Deputy Cannon's report is towards the bottom, when he talked to Joe Murray told him he was cutting wood on his property when he heard Tamara scream. Joe Murray heard his mother-in-law scream. He called 911. Later, Tammy called dispatch. You heard from both Investigator Edwards and Detective Kaikamanu about their training with paintball guns and their training with ARs. You heard from them how the scope on an AR could be mistaken for a hopper on a paintball gun. You further heard when it's dark, it's even harder to tell. You further heard that if the gun is pointed at you, it's going to be that much harder to tell. You also heard that Tammy wasn't familiar with guns. Her own kids, Emma and Garth, told you. They've never seen Tammy with a paintball gun. They've never seen Tammy with an assault rifle. But what do you know? Tammy was scared.
Next came Tammy's death, and I believe that Chad is quite happy that she's gone. As I watch through this behavior and his demeanor, he's quite smiley in parts. And in trial, there were some shockers. Chad had multiple statements that contradicted each other about Tammy's death and her cause of death. He tells one person she was choked, the other person it was an embolism, all kinds of things. And we heard from a coworker of Chad's son, Garth, who said things weren't adding up and stated that Garth told him that he came home from work and found Tammy as soon as he got home, not 6 o'clock in the morning, and that his dad was nowhere to be found. Interestingly, no reaction from Chad in closing arguments. And notable, both kids, Emma and Garth, lied on the stand. Chad had reactions to Tammy's health. His head goes right down when they play a clip from the bogus 911 call that morning of Tammy's murder, and they played his fake crying.
Chad tells Lori on July 30th of 2019, this afternoon, Tammy said she felt lightheaded, as if her body and spirit weren't connected. Interestingly enough, Coroner Dye made a similar note in a report that Chad told her something along the lines of Tammy not feeling connected to her body. Chad said that back in July. Instead, what we know is that on October 19th of 2019, just before 6 a.m., Chad Daybell and Garth Daybell made a call to 911 to report Tammy's death. Remember how Garth described her. She's stiff and cold. Remember what Chad said. She's clearly dead.
Yeah, she's not even, she's gross.
You heard the description of Tammy, stiff and cold, clearly dead. And yet, Garth and Chad say they put her back on the bed. Garth says he hears a thud and his dad calls for him. However, Garth and Chad were consistent. Tammy didn't fall out of bed. Where's the thud? They both describe the top part of Tammy falling out of the bed and her legs being tangled in the sheets. Garth would have gotten home between 1 and 1:30 from his employment. You heard Garth tell you that when he got home, he saw 2 lumps in his parents' bed, assumed it was them. He didn't go check on them. He didn't verify anything to see if they were okay. However, you heard from Micaiah Baglin that what Garth told him, that was when Garth got home from work, he found his mom dead in her bed and his dad was nowhere to be found. And you heard from Deputy Greenalch and you heard from Deputy Coroner Wilmore and Coroner Brenda Dye. And you heard them talk about what Chad told them when they were on scene. And the statements changed over time. The statements changed as new people came in. Coroner Dye mentioned something about seizures. All of a sudden, oh yeah, Tammy was having seizure-like activity. Nothing in Tammy's medical records support low blood pressure. Nothing in her medical records support seizures. Nothing in her medical records support any kind of a negative drug interaction between homeopathic medications or any other medications Tammy was on. Those were statements provided by Chad Daybell.
And the final remark by Lindsay about Tammy was Tammy had to die. Watch Chad's smirk.
Tammy Daybell was a 49-year-old mother of 5, a new grandmother. Chad labeled her as dark or possessed. Her death percentage was low. We know what happens to the body. Tammy had to die. Tylee Ryan, a 16-year-old young lady with her life ahead of her.
And as an added bonus, while Lindsay was walking through Chad's James and Elena story, that was actually the story of Chad and Lori and their aliases, Lindsay brought up Chad's scientific phenomenon known as a loin fire. And it's a phenomenon, all right. Talked about intimate details through the James and Elena story, and John Pryor was super uncomfy tapping his hands. He just looked like he just wanted this to be over.
The James and Elena story. And throughout the trial, you heard how Chad and Lori would go by different names sometimes, or they had code names or persons that they claimed to be in prior lives. James and Elena were 2 of those names. Raphael and Lily, all really Chad and Lori. The James and Elena story was written by Chad. Chad's own words. They had 2 favorite positions that particularly bonded them together. Nothing meant more to James than holding Elena in his arms and unifying their bodies in perfect synchronization. This was about sex.
Now, Chad's been convicted of the 3 murders and sentenced to death in the state of Idaho. He is, I guess, officially a serial killer with 3 murders under his belt, and who knows how many more, in my opinion. I've said before, I have a feeling that he's also going to be making a little visit to Arizona. There's been some hints at it for Charles's murder and Brandon Boudreau's attempt. And here's to hoping that justice will be served there as well. You don't just wake up one day and dismember a person like Tylee was. He has a secret life, in my opinion, has to. What do you think? Let me know below. And you gotta wonder who else was before these. Check out my video here on 10 creepy things about Chad Daybell, and click here what YouTube thinks you would like. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you in the next video.